According to the great man theory of history, human affairs are driven by exceptional individuals whose innate attributes are responsible for creating historic change. For Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle and other proponents of this theory, Napoleon Bonaparte was such a person, a figure so compelling and consequential as to be capable of altering the course of history. The theory's many critics, however, tend to argue that individuals don't in fact make history so much as they are made by it, benefiting from historic changes that happen to reward their particular gifts and predilections. This matter of greatness can scarcely be avoided in connection with the Napoleonic era, if only because its namesake was so intent on inviting comparison between himself and the great heroes of antiquity, Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar, among others. Whether Napoleon deserves inclusion in such company, or whether he was simply in the right place at the right time, has long been a subject of historical debate, and this week's reading includes plenty of fodder on both sides of the argument. In the previous episode, we learned of Napoleon's successful effort to fend off an attempt by the government in Paris to replace him with a more seasoned general. We pick up now with the balance of his operations in Italy and proceed to the ensuing Egyptian campaign, covering a period during which, for the first time, Napoleon exercised a full measure of independence and autonomy. With this for perspective, listeners are invited to judge for themselves the issue of his greatness. Having thwarted the Directory's attempt to clip his wings, and with his enemy's main force securely besieged in Mantua, Napoleon may well have thought the greater part of his difficulties in northern Italy were behind him. If so, he was mistaken. By the end of July 1796, the Austrians had replaced General Beaulieu with Dagobert Wurmser, a career soldier of long experience, who advanced southward from Trent in 2 columns, straddling Lake Garda and threatening the French line of communication. In well-coordinated attacks east of the lake, Wurmser forced Napoleon to abandon his line on the Adige River. West of the lake, the Austrian right wing, under Peter Kasdanovich, seized Brescia, cutting the French off from the most direct route to their base at Milan. At this point, fully alive to his predicament, Napoleon abandoned the siege of Mantua to prepare a new line of communication via Cremona and Piacenza. Next, rather than continue to press the French back upon Milan, Wurmser moved to resupply the Austrian forces besieged at Mantua, allowing Napoleon a temporary breathing space. Even so, the French position remained precarious, and when Wurmser crossed the Mincio River and advanced westward, Napoleon considered making a general withdrawal. With the 2 wings of the Austrian army within 5 miles of effecting a crucial linkage at the base of Lake Garda, the safest bet would have been to retreat to the south. Instead, however, he opted for a Hail Mary sort of gambit, ordering attacks on both wings of the enemy's advancing forces at once. In heavy fighting at Castiglione, the divisions of Augereau and Kilmaine succeeded in pushing Wurmser's force out of the town, while at Lonato, General Messina routed Kasdanovich's lead division, preventing the 2 enemy armies from joining forces. Indeed, the next day, convinced that Wurmser had failed to cross the Mincio, Kasdanovich withdrew the bulk of his force northward, abandoning the attempted linkage. In the course of this action, some 2,500 of Kasdanovich's men were cut off from their main body, and uncertain of their position, proceeded south in hopes of linking up with Wurmser's troops. Entering Lonato late in the evening, they discovered Napoleon and a force of only 1,000 men preparing to bivouac for the night, at which point an Austrian officer rode forward under a flag of truce, confronted the French commander and demanded his surrender. Napoleon responded by coolly informing him that it was the Austrians who were surrounded, and that he must either surrender at once or be overwhelmed. Taken in by the performance, the officer indeed surrendered, giving up his sword to a man with less than half his force, and providing another heroic story for readers of Napoleon's thrill-packed bulletins from the front. By this time, the French forces besieging Mantua had been ordered to cover a new line of communication along the road to Cremona, and on the 4th of August, a division under General Fiorello made a grueling all-night march, arriving in the rear of the Austrian line at Castiglione. Taking Wurmser completely by surprise, the move forced the Austrian commander to retreat east of the Mincio. Though exhausted and much reduced in number after 8 days of nearly continuous fighting and maneuvering, the French nonetheless remained on the offensive, pushing the Austrians out of Peschiera and threatening their line of communication. Thus, in short order, the pursuers had become the pursued, and the suddenness of the shift in fortune was enough to give Wurmser deep misgivings. After ordering the garrison at Mantua reinforced, the Austrian commander disengaged and retired northward along with his subordinate Kazdanovich. Having thus flirted with disaster on several fronts, Napoleon had prevailed. Yet as long as Mantua remained in enemy hands, his situation remained precarious. And now the newly resupplied town could be expected to hold out months longer than originally anticipated. Napoleon again laid siege to the stronghold, but was not about to stand by, awaiting its surrender. Reorganizing and reinforcing his army, he formulated plans for an advance northward in hopes of linking up with General Moreau's Army of the Rhine, which was even then advancing eastward into Tyrol. By the 5th of September, Napoleon was in Trent, where he learned that Wurmser was on his way south again. Leaving one division to secure the approaches to Tyrol, he gave chase, and on the 8th of September 2 French divisions fell upon a hastily organized Austrian rearguard outside Bassano, chasing the fleeing Austrians into the town and defeating them in heavy fighting. Wurmser, meanwhile, was only 10 miles away at Cittadella, where he gathered together the remnants of his command and continued his determined bid to break the siege of Mantua. Racing southward by way of Vicenza, he managed to outpace his exhausted pursuers and break into the fortress on the 13th. 2 days later, his numbers increased by the city's garrison, he attempted a sortie to the east, but by this time the French had arrived in force, and the breakout attempt was driven back with losses of some 4,000 men. Subsequent efforts to break the French cordon around the city were likewise defeated, and once again the French siege was reinstated. With the effective capture of Wurmser's force in Mantua, Napoleon achieved another breathing space in which to consolidate his gains. Yet the respite would not last long, and his overall situation was still doubtful. Mantua remained the key to northern Italy, and its fall was not imminent. If Wurmser's 25,000 men could be relieved, the French might yet be driven out of Austrian territory and the Directory's war of conquest ended. Elsewhere, General Moreau's campaign on the Danube had become thoroughly stalled, enabling the Austrian leadership in Vienna to redirect fresh men and resources to Italy under Baron Joseph Alvinci. With a main body of 28,000 men based in Trieste, Alvinci was to proceed west, while an additional force of 18,000 under General Paul Davidovich marched south from Tyrol. Their initial objective was Verona, where the two armies were to combine to break the siege on Mantua. Outnumbered on both fronts, the French would be forced onto the defensive. Getting under way on the last day of October, the two wings of the Austrian army made good progress despite aggressive French resistance, and by the 9th had advanced as far as Mori on the north and Vicenza in the east. At this point, however, Davidovich showed signs of running out of steam, and Napoleon began concentrating for a strike on Alvinci. On the 12th of November, an attack on the Austrian advance guard at Caldiero was repulsed with substantial losses, and now it was the French morale that began to flag. Already outnumbered, Napoleon could ill afford another such encounter, and rather than confront the Austrians head-on, he determined to slip around their flank, threaten their supply train, and knock Alvinci off balance. The ground he chose for the attack was well suited to the purpose, for the confluence of the Adige and the Alpone rivers was surrounded by extensive marshes that could only be crossed by a series of narrow dikes, limiting opportunities for maneuver and mitigating the Austrian advantage in numbers. The ensuing battle lasted 3 days, during which the French made repeated attempts to capture the town of Arcola, immediately east of the area of marshy ground and accessible by a single bridge across the Alpone. On the third day, the French threw a trestle bridge across the mouth of the river to engage Alvinci's left flank north of Albaredo, while a small force of French cavalry, a mere 29 men, slipped around the Austrian line to make a noisy charge in the enemy's rear. Thoroughly spooked, the Austrians began to give ground and were eventually driven back to Arcola, even as an Austrian sortie was being chased back across the Alpone. Assailed in front and flank, Alvinci ordered a withdrawal to San Bonifacio, and eventually fell back to the Brenta River. Napoleon next turned north once more to confront Davidovich, who had resumed his advance. On the 20th, with the bulk of the French army once more on the offensive against him, Davidovich fled northward, narrowly escaping disaster. The moment of crisis had come at Arcola, where the crossing of a narrow wooden causeway secured the victory, much as at Lodi. So too the Battle of Arcola would spawn yet another episode in the legend of the French commander. With time running out on his efforts to cut off the Austrian escape, he attempted to lead a charge in person, seizing a tricolor and starting across the bridge at the head of a small force. In an effort to prevent him, one of his aides grabbed him around the waist, and both men tumbled off the bridge into the shallow water, where they became hopelessly stuck in the mud. But for the quick response of his staff, Napoleon would have been an easy target for the Austrian counterattack that followed, but as it happened, both men were rescued in the nick of time. Meanwhile, Wurmser, though besieged in Mantua, remained a potential threat in the event of a breakout, and though driven back, Alvinci was not yet beaten. At the same time, in secret negotiations with the Pope, the Austrians were plotting to create a southern front in Italy, and on top of everything else, Napoleon's own government continued to be suspicious of him. Indeed, an agent of the Directory, General Henri Clark, was even then in Brescia, on a mission to investigate Napoleon's conduct and report back to Paris. As it happened, Clark's assessment would broadly vindicate the young commander's actions, and on the strength of his report, fresh reinforcements were sent east, which Napoleon used to consolidate his position around Verona. In addition, he was able to send a single division to Bologna to discourage any interference from the Pope. Next, convinced that the French were moving south in force to invade the Papal States, Alvinci gathered his forces for yet another effort to relieve Mantua, sending 2 divisions southwest to probe the French line along the lower Adige. He took the bulk of his army along the northern route through Rivoli. The advance began on the 7th of January, and by the 13th, French reports from Rivoli confirmed the general disposition of the enemy troops, at which point Napoleon concentrated his forces against the main attack in the north. Arriving in Rivoli early on the morning of the 14th, he sent General Joubert's division forward to occupy the high ground north of the town, where 3 enemy columns were on the move from La Corona. Meanwhile, a 4th enemy column under Kazdanovich slipped around the French right and started uphill directly in rear of Joubert's line. A hastily deployed battery of 15 guns brought the attackers to a halt, and a regiment of heavy cavalry sent them reeling back downhill. Their flank thus secured, the French now faced a threat on the left from a 5th enemy column at Affi. Proceeding east, the Austrian flanking force gained the heights of Mount Pepolo, threatening to catch the French in a trap. By this time, however, Napoleon had reinforced Joubert's isolated division and sent it forward against the main Austrian line, which broke and fled to the north. Eventually surrounded by French reserves, the Austrians on Mount Pepolo were forced to surrender. With the bulk of the French forces engaged at Rivoli, the larger Austrian strategy called for some 9,000 men under General Provera to relieve Wurmser in Mantua. Evading a French covering force at Lignago, Provera crossed the lower Adige, and on the 15th arrived on the outskirts of the besieged city. The next day, with the French racing south from Rivoli, Provera managed to get word to Wurmser inside Mantua, and the two made a joint attack on the northern end of the French cordon at La Favorita, momentarily breaking the siege. No sooner had the door been opened, however, than French forces converged from the north and east to slam it shut again, forcing Prevera to surrender and driving Wurmser back into Mantua. Less than 3 weeks later, with the death toll in the city surpassing 20,000, the besieged defenders of Mantua finally surrendered. With the defeat of Alvinzi and the fall of Mantua, Napoleon's reputation soared, and the Directory made due concessions to his triumph. Indeed, having failed of success on every other war front, the government in Paris latched onto its one rising star with something like desperation, making Italy the main theater of operations, with the Army of the Rhine for once serving a supporting role. Supplied with fresh reinforcements and given a free hand to negotiate a treaty with the Austrians, Napoleon, at 27, was once again the man of the hour. Having pursued the remnants of Alvinzi's army northward in the aftermath of Rivoli, Napoleon next established a new defensive line running roughly from Trent to Treviso. In February he paid another visit to the Papal States, where he exacted new concessions and indemnities from the Pope, then returned north to plan his advance upon Vienna. By this time the Austrians had organized yet another army and placed it under the command of Archduke Charles, the brother of Emperor Francis II. Having defeated two of the Republic's other generals, Jourdan and Moreau, Archduke Charles now carried Austria's hopes that the French might yet be defeated and driven out of Italy. Thoroughly demoralized by its recent defeats, however, the army Charles inherited would take time to rebuild and retrain, and Napoleon was not about to grant him any breathing space. Confronting the Austrian line along the Tagliamento River, he met little resistance, but in the mountain passes at Melborghetto the Austrians staged a fierce defense. Even so, the French prevailed, and driving the Austrians before him, General Massena's division proceeded to Tarvis, 2 miles from the Austrian border, arriving in time to cut off some 2,000 enemy troops on the 25th of March. By the 7th of April, French forces had battered their way as far as Leuben, 85 miles southwest of the Austrian capital, at which point, far from his base, and with no hope of support from Moreau's army, Napoleon agreed to a truce and began discussions of a peace settlement. Though the army's proximity to Vienna allowed him to negotiate from strength, the talks would drag on for months, during which time he returned to Milan to administer the territories he had conquered. When the final agreement was signed at Campo Formio on the 17th of October, 1797, France came away with dominion over the entire left bank of the Rhine, the Cisalpine Republic, northern Italy west of the Adige, and the Ionian Islands in the Adriatic. In addition, Napoleon's conquests had filled France's coffers with many millions in foreign gold, as well as hundreds of treasured works of art. By any measure, it had been a remarkable campaign. In large part, Napoleon's success was attributable to the speed with which he acted, or more precisely, reacted. Revealing a keen appreciation for the dynamic nature of battle, he developed an instinct for deploying his forces in a way to allow for the greatest flexibility in responding to changing circumstances. "One engages, then one sees," he wrote, emphasizing the commander's role in responding to events on the battlefield rather than following preconceived plans. Possessed of acute powers of concentration, he saw the battlefield as few others were able to see it, taking in at a glance the implications of terrain as well as the relative objectives of the combatants. Perhaps most remarkable of all was his ability, once battle was joined, to remain aloof and undistracted in the face of unfolding events, a trait that quickly won the respect and admiration of his fellow soldiers, inspiring confidence by example. Yet the same quality would give rise to larger questions about his character. As General Clark reported, "General Bonaparte is not without defects. He does not spare his men sufficiently. Sometimes he is hard, impatient, abrupt, or imperious. Often he demands difficult things in too hasty a manner." For some, Napoleon's ability to remain calm in the face of terrible events marked him out as a man of rare courage. For others, it pointed to an apparent inability or unwillingness to confront the human costs of battle, an insensitivity that allowed him to cast a cool eye on death and suffering. Indeed, in the years to come, many thousands were to die beneath his impassive gaze. Following the ratification of the Peace of Campo Formio in Rastatt, Austria, Napoleon returned to Paris in December of 1797. Since assuming command of the Army of Italy less than 2 years earlier, he had defeated the Republic's chief rival on the continent and vastly expanded French territory and influence in the process, for which he would receive a hero's welcome as well as a new job. With Austria now out of the war, the Directory turned its attention to the defeat of France's inveterate enemy, England, assembling ships and supplies in the Channel ports in preparation for a seaborne invasion, and raising a new army to go with it. Upon reviewing these preparations, however, Napoleon determined that French sea power was not yet sufficient to support a cross-channel expedition, and instead he proposed a plan to invade Egypt in hopes of severing the overland link between England and her chief colony, India. Such was the successful general's new influence that the plan won ready approval. Sailing from various ports along the Ligurian coast in the latter part of May 1798, the expedition rendezvoused at sea, eventually forming a flotilla of some 400 transports and 100 warships. On board was an army of 36,000 men, including the best elements of the Army of Italy, plus a large group of scientists and artists recruited for the enlightened purpose of civilizing the backward peoples of Egypt and uncovering the mysteries of a country little known to Europeans. Making its way down the coast of the Italian peninsula and into the open Mediterranean, the French Armada took 3 weeks to reach its first objective, the island of Malta, where Napoleon made a landing in force and quickly set about establishing a new French protectorate, replacing the island's existing defenders, the Order of St. John, with a garrison force of some 3,500 French soldiers, and helping himself to the accumulated wealth of the order. After resupplying his ships from the island's stores and replenishing his force with a contingent of Maltese troops, he was on his way again 9 days later, keeping a wary eye out for the Royal Navy. On the night of the 22nd of June, near the coast of Crete, the Armada narrowly escaped detection by an English squadron under Admiral Horatio Nelson, the faster English ships passing them in the darkness. Arriving off Alexandria 3 days ahead of the French, Nelson would put about and head northwest, only to miss his quarry once again. Napoleon's luck held with respect to the weather, too, as conditions remained fair throughout the nearly 2 weeks that remained of the long voyage. Reaching the Egyptian coast on the last day of June, the French fleet concentrated 6 miles east of Alexandria, off Marabut, where, amid stormy seas, Napoleon went ashore with about 4,000 men late in the day. By dawn, the assault force had reached the outskirts of Alexandria, and in stubborn fighting under a blazing sun, the invaders took possession of its strongholds. Once the new base was secured, the main body of the expedition came ashore, but when the ancient city's port proved too shallow to serve as an anchorage, the fleet proceeded eastward to the shelter of Aboukir Bay. Casting his troops in the role of liberators, come to free the Egyptian people from the rule of a warrior caste known as Mamelukes, Napoleon led the army southeast from Alexandria through fly-infested swamps and across the scorching desert toward Cairo, the French soldiers getting their first taste of a climate to which they were completely unaccustomed, and an enemy eager to pick off any stragglers. A march of 5 days brought them to the banks of the western branch of the Nile, to the village of El Ramaniya, where they flung themselves into the muddy water to relieve their suffering. Waiting nearby were some 3,500 mounted Mamelukes, who combined superb horsemanship with reckless daring, and another 2,000 members of a professional warrior caste of Turkish origin known as the Janissaries. Employing a tactic designed to neutralize the enemy's large cavalry advantage, Napoleon ordered his divisional commanders to deploy in battalion squares, hollow-centered battle formations, as many as 6 ranks deep on a side. Though the Mamelukes attacked with wonderful dexterity, they could not penetrate the solid defensive walls of French infantry, and were soon driven off, leaving hundreds of their dead on the field. Meanwhile, a small French naval force made its way upriver to the site of the battle, where they were met by some 25 Egyptian gunboats and as many lesser vessels. Badly outgunned, the French squadron received much-needed help when their comrades on shore hustled a number of artillery pieces to the river bank and sank or drove off the enemy flotilla. Even so, with the loss of some 200 sailors, it was not a banner day for the French Navy, whose fortunes would only grow worse with time. Nor was the army in a position to do much celebrating with Cairo still 100 miles away. Indeed, many of the French were to die of sunstroke, thirst, and exhaustion en route, while still others were driven to suicide by the harshness of the desert and the hostility of its inhabitants. Arriving at last outside Mbabe, immediately northwest of the capital, they discovered the enemy drawn up across their line of march in numbers nearly twice their own, a total of about 6,000 mounted Mamelukes supported by Egyptians whose numbers alone threatened to make up for the inferiority of their weaponry and tactics. Once again anticipating the greatest threat from the enemy's cavalry, Napoleon ordered an advance in battalion squares with artillery positioned at the angles. Presenting solid defensive walls to the enemy attacks, the squares served as mobile fortifications against which the Mameluke horsemen could make no impression, their penchant for swarming around individual squares only exposing them to the concentrated fire of those nearby. Meanwhile, Napoleon led a reserve division around the enemy's flank, cutting them off from their camp and shelling their rear, while 2 French divisions made a determined rush on Mbebe, sending its Egyptian defenders fleeing. Panicked by their first experience of heavy guns, many of the Arab fighters attempted to swim the Nile and were drowned. At a cost of some 300 French wounded, the Battle of the Pyramids, so named for its proximity to the ancient monuments, was a resounding French victory, adding fresh luster to Napoleon's reputation for invincibility. With the fall of Mbebe, the French swept forward as far as Giza, clearing the west bank of the Nile and opening the way to Cairo. 2 days later they were in the Egyptian capital, the remnants of the Egyptian army having moved off to the south and east. No sooner had Napoleon established himself in the country's interior, however, than alarming news arrived from the coast, where Admiral Nelson's fleet had returned on the 31st of July to discover 17 French ships of the line anchored in Aboukir Bay. Seizing upon the enemy's vulnerable position, the English commander ordered an immediate engagement, sending 5 of his 13 ships between the enemy vessels and shore to begin hammering them in a devastating crossfire. While the English suffered relatively little damage in the exchange, a total of 13 French ships were either destroyed or captured, including the pride of the fleet, L'Orient, which blew up when fires reached her powder magazine. The rest of the French ships managed to escape to Malta, but the battle would effectively eliminate French sea power in the Mediterranean for the foreseeable future. For the French army in Cairo, the implication of this stunning development was only too clear. Cut off from France, the expedition could expect no reinforcement or resupply, and thus what had begun as a campaign of conquest suddenly became a struggle for survival. Napoleon responded to the calamity by remaining outwardly undaunted, and assuring his staff that they had the means to carry on the campaign unaided. Refusing to be controlled by events, he continued to pursue his original goals, establishing a French protectorate and implementing a variety of reforms and improvements throughout the country, creating a postal service, initiating the first extensive mapping of the region, and building a large hospital for the poor. French engineers even set about planning for a canal at the Isthmus of Suez, and the chance discovery of an inscribed stone slab at Rosetta would enable French linguists to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs, unlocking the language of the pharaohs. Nevertheless, the expedition remained stranded, and under pressure from England, Turkey soon declared war on France, with a plan to send one army on an overland route to Egypt, while a second was assembled at Rhodes for a seaborne invasion. Learning of these developments through increasingly rare communications with the outside world, Napoleon planned an advance of his own into Syria, thinking to cut off the Turkish approach. First, however, he sent a division up the Nile to deal with a still active remnant of the Egyptian army. Led by General Desaix, the detachment traveled by boat as far as Asyut, before turning north to find the enemy at Sedamon. Here, on the 7th of October, the French attacked in the same hollow square formation that had succeeded at the Pyramids, with much the same result. Fleeing southward, the routed Egyptians were eventually driven as far as Aswan by French cavalry. Meanwhile, in Lower Egypt, a series of bloody revolts broke out, delaying Napoleon's plans to head off the Turkish advance. Not until the 6th of February, 1799, was he able to start east with some 13,000 men, leaving the rest of his army, approximately 16,000, to secure his base. Crossing the Sinai, the expedition laid siege to an enemy stronghold at El Arish, which fell on the 20th, yielding some 1,500 Turkish captives, who were released after swearing an oath not to take arms against the French again. This did not prevent the greater part of them from joining the Turkish force at Jaffa, however, and when the latter place fell 2 weeks later, Napoleon was confronted with more than 2,000 captives whom he could neither feed nor trust to disperse. In response, he ordered all to be lined up and systematically shot. A conqueror should know how to employ by turns severity, justice, and leniency in suppressing or preventing disturbances, he later rationalized. By the 18th of March, the French had advanced northward along the coast as far as the massive fortress at Saint-Jean d'Acre. Surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, and on all sides by massive stone walls, Acre was further defended by an English naval squadron under Sir Sidney Smith, who had the good fortune to capture a small fleet of French transports en route from Jaffa, loaded with heavy siege guns. These he quickly employed in the city's defense, along with the firepower of 2 ships of the line. Nevertheless, Napoleon was determined to lay siege to the fortress, just as Alexander the Great had done in the 4th century BC. Where Alexander had succeeded, however, his French successor would fail. Transporting the balance of his heavy guns overland from Jaffa, he managed to batter down part of the massive walls, but was stymied in his efforts to take the city by storm. On the 9th of April, with a Turkish army of some 20,000 men moving toward his rear, he sent Kleber's division inland in an effort to outflank the enemy upon his approach. Instead, the Turks managed to surround Kleber on Mount Tabor, immediately east of Nazareth, forcing Napoleon to abandon his siege works and come to the rescue. Catching the Turks as they were about to fall upon Kleber's isolated force, he put them to rout, and the French moved quickly to resupply themselves from the spoils. With the defeat of the Turkish land army, Napoleon fulfilled the strategic objective of the campaign and was free to return to Egypt to prepare for the expected seaborne invasion from Rhodes. Even so, he remained in front of Acre, determined to prevail if only for the sake of his own legend. On the 7th of May, with a fleet of Turkish reinforcements approaching the besieged city, French forces made a last furious assault on the walls, breaking into the fortress only to be driven out by a detachment of English sailors. Thwarted in his attempt to replicate the feat of Alexander the Great, Napoleon flew into a rage, calling the assault troops sissies. But with the arrival of the Turkish reinforcements, he recognized the futility of any further attempts, and on the 20th of May, he reluctantly abandoned the effort. By this time his failure to duplicate the triumph of Alexander was the least of his concerns, for his exhausted troops had begun to fall victim to an outbreak of bubonic plague, creating justifiable panic throughout the army. In an effort to inspire confidence, Napoleon made a personal visit to the plague hospitals, exposing himself to the disease for the equivalent of a modern-day photo-op. The occasion would be duly committed to canvas, if only for public relations purposes. This gesture could hardly be expected to restore the sick to health, but he did what he could for them, ensuring that they received the best of the remaining rations and assigning all of the expedition's horses, mules, and camels to carry those sick men well enough to continue the journey back to Egypt. This left the rest of the army, including the commander, to make the trip afoot in punishing heat. By the time they completed their journey, fully a third of the original force had become casualties. On the 14th of June, the ragged survivors arrived back in Cairo, where a victory parade was held to celebrate their success. Under the circumstances, it was a case of whistling in the dark, for while the threat of a Turkish overland incursion had been dispelled, the army's losses had been irreplaceable, and its prospects as an occupying force were growing darker by the day. Without reinforcements or the possibility of returning to their homeland, the French faced a bleak future amid an increasingly hostile population, for local uprisings persisted, and all along their supply routes the French were subjected to raids and guerrilla attacks. Then, on the 11th of July, came news from the coast that the Turkish seaborne expedition from Rhodes had arrived in a fleet of 100 ships. Landing at Aboukir, 15 miles east of Alexandria, the enemy had occupied a fort at the top of Aboukir Bay and was preparing for battle. Napoleon wasted no time in obliging them. Recalling Desaix's division to Cairo from Upper Egypt, he held General Rainier's force in reserve to defend against an incursion from the east, concentrating the rest of the army on Alexandria. By the 24th, he had close to 8,000 men on hand with which to confront as many as 18,000 Turks. Their commander, white-bearded Mustafa Pasha, had stationed his frontline troops on 3 hills along the approaches to an extensive peninsula dominated by Fort Aboukir. In front of them, a solid Turkish battle line stretched across the neck of the peninsula. Early on the 25th, Napoleon sent 2 infantry divisions forward against the outlying hills, with a cavalry force between them. While the infantrymen assailed the enemy positions in front, the cavalry commander, Murat, divided his force into 2 wings and sent them wheeling around the enemy's flanks. Swift and brutal, the French horsemen overran the isolated positions, driving many of the defenders into the sea. When a Turkish sortie was sent out to support their fleeing comrades, it was met by a fresh division of French infantry and Murat's ubiquitous horsemen, who once again rode around and behind them. Assailed on all sides, the would-be rescuers soon joined their countrymen in headlong flight for the relative safety of the sea. Their front-line defenses thus shattered, the remaining Turks awaited attack behind a secondary line near the tip of the peninsula. Here an initial French infantry assault was thrown back with considerable loss, and the Turks rushed forward to take the heads of the fallen. No sooner had they set about their grisly business, however, than they were caught and overrun by a timely counterattack. Meanwhile, General Murat exploited a gap along the bay shore to drive once again into the enemy rear. Amid a force of janissaries, Mustafa Pasha put up fierce resistance, but in the end he too was routed. Apart from some 3,000 survivors who held out in Fort Aboukir for another week, the Turkish army had been utterly destroyed, with 2,000 dead on the field and as many as 10,000 drowned while attempting to swim to safety. At a cost of about 150 French dead, Napoleon had redeemed the failure at Acre and provided convincing evidence of French military dominance. And yet the French remained a long way from home and short on hopes of returning. During negotiations over the Turkish wounded, Sir Sidney Smith had seen to it that a packet of newspapers was sent ashore, in which Napoleon learned of disastrous developments on the continent. In the years since the expedition had departed, 2 French armies had suffered major defeats, and a new coalition, including England, Austria, Russia, Naples, and Turkey, had declared war on France, undertaking a 3-pronged invasion of newly won French territories. In addition, a paper dated the 10th of June 1799 reported that an Austro-Russian army had invaded northern Italy, reclaiming all of the hard-won territory Napoleon had conquered in his previous campaign. Furthermore, it seemed France was on the verge of economic collapse. and in response Napoleon made a fateful and revealing decision. Under the circumstances, the country surely needed her most successful general at home. For all he knew, the Directory had already sent for him, which indeed proved to be the case. Whatever the risks, whatever the world might say, he must make every effort to return to the capital as soon as possible. Thus, placing General Kléber in charge in Egypt, he secretly arranged for 4 small ships to carry him and a select group of officers back to France, and on the 22nd of August, 1799, the small flotilla put to sea. The rest of his army and the artists and scientists he had invited on his great adventure would be left to their fates.